an abandoned boy, a mother who would not break, a world built on betrayal, and a storm destined to own it all.
Yet Oelun remembered the day she understood that her eldest son was no longer simply a child. It was not the first time he brought down an animal on the hunt, nor the day he helped reclaim Berta, the stolen bride whose fate had once seemed sealed. These were victories, yes, but they were not the true turning. It was the silence. He stopped complaining, stopped asking why the world had turned against them, stopped looking at the horizon with confusion or fear. Instead, he began to observe, to measure, to calculate. He looked at the steppe not as an enemy to be endured, but as a force to be understood and eventually used. He was not like his father. Yasuge had been fire, bright, fierce, quick to ignite and quick to burn. Temujin was something else entirely. Ice, cold, clear, patient ice that forms slowly over deep water. Difficult to break, impossible to intimidate. There was little of the noisy bravado common among young warriors, no careless boasting, no hunger for shallow glory. Instead, there was attention, stillness, a mind always working behind quiet eyes. At first, others did not notice. Why would they? The steppe was full of struggling families, forgotten heirs, wandering outcasts. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, people began to arrive. Men who had lost everything, men betrayed by their own clans, men who had seen enough of the old tribal games and found them hollow. They came cautiously, suspicious, hungry. Oelun watched them approach their lonely camp with unease. Strangers in the steppe rarely bring good fortune. Every new face could mean theft, betrayal, or death. She feared that these men would bring only another wave of hardship. But something unexpected happened. They did not come as raiders. They came as followers. One by one, hardened wanderers and dispossessed fighters stood before her son and lowered themselves to their knees. Not out of ritual politeness, not out of fear, out of recognition. They saw in him something the steppe had taught them to value above all else: certainty. Oelun watched from the shadow of the yurt as Temujin spoke with them. He did not shout, did not promise wealth or easy victories, did not drown them in grand speeches. He spoke quietly, directly, without ornament. He offered them no illusions, only purpose. He took the fear that lived inside each of them, the same fear he had known since childhood, and gave it direction, forged it into loyalty, into discipline, into something resembling hope. Standing behind the felt curtain of the yurt, Oelun felt a strange chill settle into her chest. She understood. The bitterness she had fed him, the endurance she had demanded, the cold lessons carved into his childhood by hunger and abandonment, all of it had taken root, and what was growing from that soil was powerful, powerful and dangerous. She watched the small group around him grow larger, watched his presence extend beyond the narrow circle of their family's survival, watched as his name began to move across the steppe like a distant storm. He was no longer growing upward like a boy becoming a man. He was expanding outward, gathering people, gathering strength, gathering destiny. In time, his name would be spoken more often than the names of ancient spirits, more often than the names of old tribal lords who once believed themselves eternal. But in those early days, he was still her son, and yet already no longer entirely hers. She saw the blood that began to mark his path, saw the enemies broken, the rival clans subdued, the old order slowly bending beneath his will. She did not turn away. She remembered too clearly the taste of bitter roots, the humiliation of abandonment, the long winters when survival itself had been uncertain. Every drop of blood spilled now seemed, in some harsh and private way, a payment for that first injustice. Years later, when the great gathering at the Onan River filled the steppe with banners and thunderous voices, she stood among the countless witnesses. They called his name as if calling upon a god. Former enemies bowed their heads. Proud lords lowered their eyes before the boy they had once dismissed as dust beneath their boots. What did she feel in that moment? Pride was too small a word, too simple for the cold fire that burned within her. It was not joy, not relief. It was something harder, sharper, a frozen triumph. She looked at the figure standing above the sea of people within the white felt pavilion, and she did not see a conqueror. She saw a boy with clenched fists standing beside a cold fire in a winter without mercy. A boy who had learned too early that the world offers nothing freely. She saw her creation. She had not raised him on warmth. She had raised him on endurance, on bitterness, on the iron necessity of survival. And that harsh nourishment had made him unbreakable. In that moment, as the voices of thousands roared his new name into the sky, she understood something final. The son she once held close had vanished long ago. Perhaps in that first winter of abandonment. Perhaps in the first silent decision to never again be powerless. Temujin, the boy, had died somewhere along that road. Before her now stood something larger, a force shaped by hunger, sharpened by loss, and guided by an unyielding will. He no longer belonged to her, he belonged to history. And Oelun, old now, her hands marked by every hardship they had endured, stood upright among the roaring multitude. She did not weep, for the mothers of storms do not cry.
The wind and the mother. Before the world learned to fear his name, before armies moved like dark tides across continents, before cities burned beneath a sky blackened with smoke, there was only the steppe. An ocean of grass beneath an endless sky, a land without walls, without mercy, without memory. And above it all, always moving, always watching, there was the wind. The wind of the Mongol steppe does not simply blow, it carves, it erases, it teaches. It carries the smell of distant fires and the promise of hunger. It howls through the bones of the land like a voice older than any tribe, older than any empire. It has no loyalty, no pity, no rest. And for one boy, abandoned to its endless cold, it became the first and most merciless teacher. But before the boy learned to listen to the wind, there was a woman who had already heard its voice. Her name was Oelun. The wind spoke to her before it ever spoke to him. She heard its low mourning howl the night her husband, Yasuge, died, poisoned by the tatters, far from home, far from safety. A chieftain brought down not in battle, but by deceit, the oldest weapon of the steppe. She heard the wind again when their world collapsed. The clan that had once ridden under Yasuge's banner did not stay. They did not protect the widow. They did not honor his memory. They took the herds. They took the yurts. They took what little security remained. And then they left. Left a woman with children in the open steppe as winter crept across the land like a slow, silent executioner. In the steppe, abandonment is a death sentence, not always quick, never merciful. In later centuries, in distant cities surrounded by stone and comfort, people would speak of motherhood with softness, with warmth, with gentle images of care and protection. Oelun knew none of that. She had no time for tenderness, no strength for lullabies whispered in the night. The steppe does not reward softness, it devours it. Her hands, once familiar with silk and the quiet dignity of a chieftain's household, changed. Skin cracked, fingers hardened. They became like the twisted roots of the Saxal shrub, always clawing into dry earth, always searching for something that could be eaten, burned, or traded for another day of life. Each morning began with calculation, each night ended with exhaustion. She searched the frozen ground for bitter roots. She set traps for small animals that barely fed a growing family. She chewed tough strips of dried meat slowly, carefully, so the children would not see how little remained. Hunger became the constant companion of their days. Cold became the judge of their nights, and always the wind watched. She watched her eldest son more closely than the others, Temujin. At first, he was only a boy among boys, thin, tired, frightened in the way all abandoned children are frightened. But hunger changes the face faster than time. She saw the soft roundness of childhood vanish from his cheeks, saw sharp bones emerge beneath tightening skin, saw his eyes darken. There are many kinds of hunger, the simple hunger that asks for bread, and the deeper hunger that asks for justice. In his eyes, she saw the second, a cold, silent demand for a world that would never abandon him again, a refusal to remain prey in a land ruled by wolves. And Oelun did not try to extinguish that hunger, she fed it. When she gave the last pieces of dried horse meat to her children and swallowed only her own saliva, she was not teaching them gentleness, she was teaching them survival. She taught them that the world was not a shelter, it was a set of teeth. To live, one had to become harder than the jaws closing around you, stronger than the hands trying to push you into the dirt, colder than the night that froze the unprepared. Love in such a world was not softness, it was endurance. She taught them duty, not to tribe, not to tradition, but to survival itself. A duty that stood above comfort, above mercy, above fear. Years passed in this relentless education. The steppe remained indifferent. Winter gave way to brief, dusty summers and returned again with renewed cruelty. Nothing became easier, nothing became certain, but something within the boy changed. There is no single moment when a child becomes something else, no clear dividing line between innocence and resolve. The transformation is slow, almost invisible.
The wind. Before the names of great Khans thundered across continents, before the ground trembled beneath the hooves of countless horses, before cities learned to fear the horizon itself, there was only the steppe. And in that vast, breathing emptiness, there was the wind. It was the first voice of that world, its oldest inhabitant, its most faithful witness. Empires rise and fall, tribes appear and vanish like tracks in the dust, but the wind remains. It moves without allegiance, without judgment, without memory. It does not care who rules the land beneath it. It does not mourn the dead. It does not celebrate the victorious. It simply moves, carrying with it the scent of smoke, the echo of hoofbeats, the distant cries of men who believe their struggles matter. And this story begins with the moment the wind found a student. When the young Temujin was left nearly alone in the cold emptiness after his father's death and his clan's betrayal, the wind became his constant companion. Not a gentle one, not a kind one, a relentless tutor. It offered him no comfort, no shelter, no sympathy. It blew into his face with cutting force, stripping away the softness of childhood as sand strips polish from fragile stone. It drove cold into his bones and hunger into his days. It carried the bitter scent of wormwood and the distant metallic whisper of enemies moving somewhere beyond the horizon. At night, it did not sing lullabies. It brought the howling of wolves and the thin cries of animals that had not survived the dark. It reminded him again and again that the steppe belonged only to those who endured. Day after day, night after night, the wind carved a single command into the boy's heart: survive. Not with pride, not with honor, simply survive. At first he endured it as all abandoned children endure the world, with clenched teeth and silent fear. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something changed. He began to listen, not with his ears alone, but with a deeper attention born of necessity. He learned that the wind carried messages for those patient enough to read them. A faint trace of smoke drifting across the grass could reveal an unseen camp beyond the hills. A sudden shift in direction might signal approaching riders long before they appeared. The restless movement of herds far away spoke of water, of shelter, of opportunity. What had once been a hostile force became a source of knowledge. The wind, once an enemy, became a scout, a guide, a silent ally. Fear slowly transformed into calculation. The boy who had once been tossed about by circumstances began to understand the patterns within them. He learned to anticipate rather than react, to watch rather than panic, to move with purpose rather than desperation. This was not a transformation that happened in a single moment. There was no revelation beneath a storm-lit sky, no sudden awakening. It was gradual, patient, hard-earned. The kind of change that occurs when survival leaves no room for illusion. Years passed, and the relationship between the boy and the wind evolved. What had once been a brutal teacher became something closer to a companion, still harsh, still demanding, but now understood. He no longer fought the steppe, he began to read it. He no longer resisted the wind, he began to use it. When he moved across the grasslands, he moved with awareness of currents invisible to others. When he planned, he considered distances and directions that most warriors ignored. When he fought, he did so with the patience of someone who knew that time itself could be a weapon. The lessons of the wind were never spoken, never written, never explained. They were absorbed through endurance, through observation, through the quiet discipline of staying alive when death would have been easier. And then, years later, came a moment when the steppe itself seemed to pause. A vast gathering by the Oelun River, banners snapping beneath an open sky, thousands of riders assembled in a single place, drawn together by the gravity of one man's ascent. In that moment, as voices rose and echoed across the grasslands, something shifted. The student had become the storm. The armies that now followed him moved with the same relentless force as the wind that had shaped him. They appeared from distant horizons and vanished just as quickly. They struck with speed and precision that left enemies disoriented and terrified. They carried with them not only weapons, but momentum, an unstoppable advance that seemed almost elemental. Cities would later say they were destroyed by an army, but those who witnessed it closely often spoke of something else, a natural force, a storm that could not be negotiated with, could not be delayed, could not be reasoned with, only endured, if endurance was even possible. Yet the most remarkable transformation lay not in destruction, but in control. For the man shaped by the chaos of the steppe did not merely unleash that chaos upon the world, he sought to harness it. The same will that had allowed him to survive abandonment now sought to impose structure upon a fractured landscape. From the wild, shifting loyalties of the steppe, he began to forge a system. From the unpredictability of tribal warfare, he began to create order. What had once been a force of pure survival evolved into a vision of discipline, of law, of unity. He took the raw, ungovernable energy of the world that had shaped him and bound it into something resembling structure. The winds that once scattered tribes across endless grasslands now seemed to converge behind a single will. And when he established the great law, the yasa, it was as if the storm itself had been given direction. What had once been destruction without pattern became destruction with purpose, followed by a severe and uncompromising order. Caravans began to move across vast distances with unprecedented safety. Merchants traveled roads that had once been death traps. Messengers crossed continents with a speed never before imagined. The wind that had once carried only dust and danger now carried news, trade, ideas. Yet beneath this order, the original force remained unchanged, unsentimental, unforgiving, relentless. And when, many years later, the man who had once been a starving boy in the steppe finally disappeared from the world of the living, there were stories. Stories that the wind fell silent for a single moment across the great expanse of his dominion. Stories that the grass itself seemed to bow. Stories that the sky held its breath. Perhaps these were only myths, created by those who needed meaning. Perhaps they were no more than the natural human desire to see patterns where none exist. But one idea endured, that he had not simply died, that he had returned to the force that had shaped him, that he had become inseparable from the endless movement of air across the steppe. Even now, when the wind moves across the Mongolian plains, it carries echoes of an older world. The whisper of hooves, the distant clatter of arms, the memory of a will that refused to be erased. Listen closely, and the sound is still there. Not merely the movement of air through grass and over earth, but the lingering presence of a life forged in hardship, sharpened by loss, and carried forward by the same relentless force that once threatened to destroy it. The wind was his first teacher. In time, it became his herald, and in the end, perhaps, it became his eternity.
Two faces of the Iron Khan. The story of Temujin, who would become known to the world as Genghis Khan, is not a straight line drawn from obscurity to power. It is a blade forged from two different metals, fused together in heat and pressure until they became a single, unbreakable edge. All his life, he carried this duality within him. It shaped his decisions. It defined his rule. It left those who encountered him uncertain of what they were truly facing. Was he a builder of order in a fractured world, or a destroyer without mercy? The answer lies not in what he became, but in how he was formed. His first and most enduring education came not from victory, but from abandonment. When his father died, and the fragile structure of his early life collapsed, Temujin saw the world stripped of illusion. He saw loyalty vanish when it was no longer convenient. He saw alliances dissolve the moment they required sacrifice. He saw how quickly a respected family could become prey. In that harsh awakening, compassion became a dangerous luxury. Trust became a calculated risk. Survival demanded clarity, and clarity often demanded hardness. His mother, Oelun, stood at the center of that transformation, a woman whose strength did not come from comfort, but from necessity. She concealed hunger behind discipline, fear behind determination, despair behind a relentless will to endure. He watched her ration food with absolute fairness, even when fairness meant her own suffering. Watched her refuse to beg for mercy from those who had abandoned them. Watched her turn humiliation into resolve. From her he learned a simple, unforgiving lesson. The world does not reward weakness, it consumes it. In the cold isolation of those early years, something within him hardened, not into mindless cruelty, but into a form of emotional precision, a way of seeing people and situations without the comforting filters of tradition or sentiment. The world divided itself into clear categories, those who stood with him and those who stood against him. There was no space for ambiguity, no safe middle ground. From this emerged the first face of the man he would become, the destroyer. As his power grew and his following expanded, he dealt with betrayal swiftly and without hesitation, not from impulse, but from calculation. In the environment that had shaped him, hesitation invited collapse. Mercy toward treachery invited repetition. When cities resisted his authority, he responded with overwhelming force. When rival leaders plotted against him, he eliminated them completely. To those outside his circle, he appeared merciless, a figure of relentless violence moving across the steppe and beyond. Stories of devastation traveled faster than his armies. They moved ahead of him like shadows, preparing the ground through fear. By the time his forces arrived, resistance often collapsed beneath the weight of reputation alone. To many, this seemed the essence of his nature, proof that he was nothing more than a conqueror driven by destruction. But this interpretation captures only half of the truth, for within the same man lived a second impulse, one that did not seek chaos, but its opposite, order. If he had been only a warlord driven by appetite for plunder, his story would have ended quickly.
He would have remained one more ambitious chieftain among many, his name fading after a generation. The steppe had seen countless such figures rise and disappear. What distinguished him was not merely his ability to destroy old structures, but his determination to build new ones. From the earliest days of his leadership, he gathered not only warriors of noble birth, but outcasts, men without powerful families, men rejected by established clans, men whose only asset was loyalty. He judged them not by lineage, but by reliability, not by heritage, but by commitment. This approach defied centuries of steppe tradition, where ancestry determined status and opportunity. By elevating individuals based on merit and allegiance rather than blood, he began to reshape the social fabric of his world. Within his growing circle, discipline replaced tribal rivalry. Shared purpose replaced inherited division. What had once been scattered groups bound loosely by convenience began to cohere into something resembling a unified force. To those within this new structure, he could be intensely fair. He shared hardships alongside his followers, divided spoils according to clearly understood rules, rewarded loyalty with advancement and trust. There are accounts of him mourning fallen companions with visible grief, accounts of him ensuring that the families of loyal warriors were protected and provided for, accounts that reveal a leader capable of deep attachment within the boundaries he defined. This was not softness, it was selective humanity. Compassion, in his world, was not extended universally. It was reserved for those who stood within the circle of loyalty and law he was constructing. Outside that circle lay uncertainty, and often destruction. This duality reached its fullest expression in the empire he forged. It expanded through relentless campaigns that reshaped the political map of Eurasia. Cities fell, kingdoms collapsed, populations were displaced or destroyed. Yet in the wake of conquest came structure. He introduced systems of communication that allowed messages to travel across vast distances with unprecedented speed, established protections for merchants and travelers moving through his territories, encouraged trade and exchange between regions that had previously existed in isolation. He imposed the yasa, a comprehensive code of law that governed military discipline, social conduct, and administrative order. It was strict, unforgiving in its enforcement, but it created a framework within which diverse peoples could function under a single authority. Religious tolerance, unusual for the era, became policy. Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and practitioners of traditional steppe beliefs found themselves able to worship within the same imperial domain, provided they did not challenge the overarching structure of power. For those who accepted his authority and adhered to his law, the empire offered stability, security, opportunity. For those who resisted, it offered devastation. This was the paradox at the core of his existence. He used absolute violence to impose absolute order. He destroyed ancient systems to construct a new one shaped by his own experience of betrayal and survival. He sought to create a world in which the chaos of his childhood could not easily repeat itself. Was he a tyrant? Undeniably. His campaigns brought suffering on a massive scale. Was he a builder of systems that outlived him? Equally undeniable. He was both, a man who carried within himself the memory of helplessness and the determination never to experience it again. A leader who understood the fragility of loyalty and sought to enforce it through structure and fear. A conqueror whose vision extended beyond conquest into governance. In him, destruction and creation were not opposing forces, they were complementary tools. To his enemies, he appeared as a force of pure devastation, an unstoppable storm descending from the steppe. To his followers, he was the architect of a new and formidable order. Neither view alone is complete. Together, they form the blade that history remembers, a blade forged from two faces, both real, both inseparable. And it was this impossible fusion of selective humanity and uncompromising brutality that transformed Temujin from a struggling survivor into a figure whose shadow would stretch across centuries.